You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 496 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. And, as I get up there closer and closer to 500, I'm getting more excited about that, big milestone episode, but also thinking about all the shows I've done, including so many with my guest today, Will Porter. I'm pretty sure it would have been very, very difficult to make it to 500, if not, wouldn't have happened at all if I didn't have so many chances to interview you and just talk about all the great things that you've been writing over at RT, where you're a staff writer, or some of the articles that we've written together, and all of your work that you've published at places like antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, and the Libertarian Institute, which is where you find this podcast and the daily news roundup that I write. So, Will, welcome back to the show. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm great, Kyle. How you doing? I appreciate all the kind things you said about my work.
Well, I don't know. So just before this, I was doing one of my, kind of favorite non-libertarian anti-war things, which was watching NASCAR. Except this is one of the more painful races. Like, I can't even watch the pre-race show anymore because it's Memorial Day, and there's all this like fanfare and honor the troops and everything. And so I really want to talk about like the news stories that you've written about and we have to cover today. But I thought it would be worth it to take a second to mention two articles that I think have really, really good perspectives on Memorial Day. One is by Doug Bandow, and that's running today at antiwar.com, linked in the show notes page found at the Libertarian Institute. And in it, he just basically explains, and the title outright says it, that if you want to honor American troops, you got to stop, sending them to die in these wasteful wars, and just goes over the history of wasteful wars the U.S. has fought all the way back to the Mexican-American War. So, as always, Doug Bandow's fantastic on these wars and points out the obvious, that the real way to value a U.S. soldier's life isn't by, putting his wife and kids on, mainstream television because, he died over in Afghanistan and, falsely claimed that he was fighting for his freedoms. What you do to honor him is you don't send him to die in the first place. And so an excellent point by Bandow. And that little thing is from the NASCAR race. They have like the names of fallen soldiers on all the cars, and then they're cutting to clips of these people's most of, at least my looking at, most of the families look kind of uncomfortable with what's going on. I don't know if they like realize it or they don't like having the camera shoved in their face, but it's definitely sanitizing, I think, the deaths of the American soldiers overseas, by having, again, like just this like, oh, they died for valor and honor and our freedoms, and none of it's true. The other article is by retired U.S. Army Major Danny Sjursen. He writes all the time at antiwar.com. I think me and Will mention his articles, on our shows fairly frequently. He's always writing about really great stuff and, does a lot of great historical work and then, stuff on the current wars. But his take on Memorial Day, I think, was so great because he's like, hey, let's look at all the other people who have died in these wars and like, where do they fit in as we're memorializing the wars? They think between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese people have died. Imagine that, like the number of people who have died are between 1 and 3 million. What kind of huge range and estimate is that? I talked to Scott Horton about this once, and he was like, yeah, they annihilated entire villages. So who knows how many people died? There's nobody even left to report how many people died. It's not like, in the movies where the bad guy kills 30 and leaves, one kid left, so, tell people what happened. There's not even that one kid left. They're just all dead. And so, he goes from that to Iraq and all the other wars and all the civilian casualties, whether it's, just dying by U.S. bombs or some other way the U.S. policy led to the, that person's ultimate demise. So both of those articles, again, linked in the show notes page. And I think it's a good way to talk about Memorial Day. And Danny Sjursen, he was in the army. He served in Afghanistan and Iraq. He was in both surges. He has seen, the peak of both of these wars, and this is his take on it. So it's not, just looking to shame veterans or anything like that. And again, the Bandow point is, I think, a great one to make on Memorial Day, especially more to, your right-wing friends to say like, hey, you love the soldiers. Every right-wing senator and representative loves to talk about how much they love the soldiers. That's like their, some of their best political talking points. And so if you really do, bring them home and let them be with their families and loved ones and go grill on Memorial Day rather than getting their legs blown off driving around on some pointless mission in Afghanistan. So I don't know. Well, I know I opened the show with a rant that we really did plan to talk about, but if you have any thoughts on Memorial Day, I'll let you start off with that before we get into your work.
Yeah, I mean, no, those are two great points there, that like oftentimes the people who are like wrapping themselves in the troops the most are the ones who are the most willing to put them in harm's way. So that's like, that's something good to point out on this day when a lot of people are kind of, going rah rah for the troops. To remember that, who's putting them in harm's way. And then also, it's also, a great point to point out who is bearing the brunt of these wars. It's not just the soldiers, to be sure,
Definitely. And, there's so many other consequences to our wars, Will. And we end up in these ridiculous, I don't even know if you could call it an official alliance, but, on the same side as Saudi Arabia and, different wars, the genocide in Yemen and all of that. And then when something happens, like the event that gives Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman his nickname, Prince Bonesaw, the U.S. doesn't react to this event and ends up just continuing on with the Saudi relationship. So I don't know, Will, I guess maybe remind us how Mohammed bin Salman got that terrible nickname Prince Bonesaw, and then what are the current updates in the murder and the investigation and justice of Jamal Khashoggi?
Sure, yeah. So it's been a minute since we've heard this name in the press, in the headlines, Jamal Khashoggi. But just last week, it's now back into the headlines. And I might go sort of in reverse order here. So I might start with the update, then we can kind of we can back our way into some of the the interesting stuff surrounding this event. And so last week we had one of the sons of Jamal Khashoggi, the murdered Washington Post columnist who was killed in the Saudi consulate in Turkey in 2018. The son of Khashoggi, Salah, came out with a statement saying that his family, the Khashoggi family, has now forgiven this journalist killer. And this came right at the end of Ramadan, which is like, I think it's like a customary thing for Muslims around this time to sort of like make amends and grant forgiveness to people who wronged you. And so they came out with a statement forgiving the killers. And it's not just a matter of personal forgiveness from the family. They're not just like stating their opinion or something. Under Saudi law, families of the victim of certain crimes, I know definitely murder, I'm not sure if it applies to other offenses, but families can actually like pardon perpetrators. The Saudi system is kind of based around the Quran and Islam and stuff, and this concept is called diya, and it comes from the Quran, that families can like give amnesty to perpetrators. And I'm not like super deeply knowledgeable about how the Saudi legal system works, or even Islam and Sharia law and stuff. But as far as I understand, in the Saudi context, victims' families have the option of either they can like demand punishment, which in the Saudi system for murderers usually is the death penalty. They can waive the execution. And then there's a third option where they can ask for payment in exchange for a pardon, which like, if you go and read about this practice, a lot of people have sort of characterized that as blood money. And so Khashoggi's family is granting some kind of mercy to the killers of Jamal Khashoggi. But it's not totally clear like what route they're taking, whether they're asking for money or just offering a pardon or just offering mercy. I also don't think it's clear. I don't think it's even known whether the convicts are going to be freed from jail and like totally exonerated, or whether they're just going to be spared the death penalty. I wasn't actually able to find an answer to that. All I know for sure is that the family has offered some kind of reprieve, and that has significance under Saudi law. Now, some reporting has suggested that the family has already received a huge cash payment from the Saudi government for the murder of Khashoggi. And so, maybe they wouldn't be taking more money now, but the family has denied receiving money too. So it's kind of hard to say, what would be the case there. The Saudi government, though, does sometimes pay the tab for these kind of blood money payments. So that wouldn't be totally out of the norm, for them to have already made this transfer, especially for such like a high profile case. But in this killing, 5 people ended up on death row for Khashoggi's murder. And so those 5 would definitely be getting some kind of mercy. Either they're going to be spared the death penalty, or they're actually going to be freed. And I think 3 other people were also sentenced to like 25 years in prison in this. I'm not totally sure if it's going to have if this reprieve will like apply to them. But in this killing, I think the kill squad, that the Saudi kill squad, I think it was supposed to be like 15 or 17 men in total. And so some people, like if you just look at who's been sentenced in this case, some people have definitely escaped punishment in this whole thing. And I think you could definitely say that too as you start going up the food chain in terms of like, authority. But there are all kinds of questions still around like exactly what happened here and why. Like, we do know for a fact that Jamal Khashoggi visited the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, in October of 2018, and he never came out. We have pretty good reason to think that he was killed and dismembered inside of the consulate building. But, like, there's a lot of stuff that we still really don't know. Like, I don't think they ever actually found his remains, so, like, we don't really know what ended up happening to his physical body. But it does seem pretty clear that the Saudi government like had way more to do with this whole thing than they've let on. Like, I think that's sort of something that no one even really disputes other than the Saudis themselves. And the Saudis, after running through this crazy shape-shifting narrative, they finally landed on this story that Khashoggi was killed in this rogue operation that was carried out by like lower level officials for some unknown reason, I guess. That he was lured to the consulate, and I think the story is that they were planning on kidnapping him, but that like, he refused, and it turned into a brawl broke out, and then they killed him. There were a couple different like conflicting stories about exactly how he ended up dying, whether he was killed by lethal injection or strangled to death. There's a couple different stories. But what we do know too, though, is that some of these people in this kill squad there was a lot of connections to the royal family and the crown prince. You had one of them was a bodyguard who had appeared on TV with the Crown Prince a bunch of times. Another guy was an intelligence officer who had traveled extensively with Mohammed bin Salman. There were a handful of higher level people who were implicated in this whole thing who they lost their jobs but didn't end up actually getting charged or anything. But one of these higher level people who lost their jobs was Saud al-Qahtani, who was a very close advisor to Mohammed bin Salman and the previous king. There was another guy named Major General Ahmed al-Asiri, who was very ensconced in the prince's inner circle. So there were all kinds of connections to the crown prince here. And so like that, I don't know. I think we can kind of assume that he pretty much was involved here. I mean, the CIA even leaked to the Washington Post. And the Post, usually I'm, pretty skeptical of a lot of things they report. But they actually did quite a bit of like aggressive reporting on this because Khashoggi worked for them. But they actually got a leak from the CIA saying that, they had high confidence that bin Salman personally ordered this killing. So there's that too. I'm also skeptical of the CIA whenever they want to leak anything. They always have some kind of ulterior motive. But that was their position on this, that bin Salman was definitely the guy who ordered this. And I think we should also remember too that this all came during bin Salman's massive purge, where he was arresting all these other royal members of the royal family and consolidating the decision-making process around himself. And so I think it's pretty unlikely that this like high-profile assassination plot would have escaped his notice, or that he wouldn't have ordered, like this wouldn't have been something he ordered himself. And I guess I'll go through a couple other just like loose ends to this too. You had the Washington Post reporting that U.S. intelligence agencies were aware of the plot to kidnap Khashoggi sometime before his disappearance. But for some reason, like the U.S. intelligence agencies have this duty to warn that if they find out there's a plan to kill or capture somebody, they have to tell them. But apparently they didn't tell Khashoggi about this. And you have similar reports too about the British GCHQ, which is like their NSA, where they were aware of this kidnapping plot, like 3 weeks before Khashoggi was murdered. And so that's pretty weird that the CIA and the GCHQ would have been aware of this, but and had a chance to stop it, but apparently they didn't. I'm not really sure why that would have happened, why they wouldn't have done more there. But the last thing I'll say here is related to the motive of why they would have killed Khashoggi, because I think there's a lot of questions still surrounding that as well. The U.S. corporate press described Khashoggi as this like vocal dissident and powerful critic of the Saudi regime, but that was a pretty big exaggeration. Like, he did have some criticisms of bin Salman, but and especially during the purge. And remember that during the purge, Khashoggi's own favorite royal and his one-time patron, Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, was arrested, and he had some of his assets seized. So Khashoggi kind of had like a personal stake in that, and like that's when he was really criticizing bin Salman. But Khashoggi also regularly defended some of Saudi's worst policies. He defended the war in Yemen. some of their capital punishment practices of beheading people, and some of the reasons they'll behead people for sorcery and stuff like that. Like, he was not that strong of a critic of the Saudi government. And the criticisms he did make didn't really seem like they would have been enough to motivate his assassination. And so something that some people have speculated about in some reports is that Khashoggi, at the time of his death, he was in the middle of setting up this thing called Dawn, this political advocacy group, Democracy in the Arab World Now. And he had backed like a bunch of the Arab Spring uprisings and sort of positioned himself behind those, and like thought it was a sign of progress and stuff. And so this group, Dawn, was apparently going to try to cultivate some of that same energy and activism elsewhere in the Middle East. And so at the time of his killing, he was like getting foreign investors for it and stuff. And I don't think it was that far off the ground yet. But like, I do think this could have played some role in the motivation to kill him. You know, had he been seeking funders or people to back him in this from Saudi adversaries, you know, I think that's a valid question to ask whether that might have played into this murder. And another thing, too, is that Khashoggi had some ties to Qatar, which is a big regional rival to Saudi Arabia. And I think that may have also possibly played into his political group, Dawn. He was also working with this group called the Qatar Foundation International, which is a think tank that was like founded by Qatari royals. And he apparently was letting executives from this group like shape his columns and suggest topics. And they were reportedly like often prodding him to be more harsh against the Saudi government. And there's even reports in Saudi newspapers that Khashoggi met with the Emir of Qatar in New York not long before his death. And so I think these things do raise some questions about, like, you know, whether they had anything to do with his murder. Like, I don't think Khashoggi's columns in his writing would be enough to really motivate his assassination. He wasn't that critical. And so I think, you know, we have to there's a lot of dots that we haven't connected yet, but we sort of have to ask still, like, why would they have been motivated to murder this guy?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an unfortunate story because so many questions are going unanswered, in part because of how much the Trump administration loves selling weapons. It seems to me that there's really no other reason the Trump administration has come up with to continue the support of Saudi Arabia. At this point, the oil really isn't a necessity, especially, you know, as we look at things with, you know, in the coronavirus, and who knows going forward what the demand for oil will be. So, I mean, Will, do you see any good reason why the U.S. is, I guess, kind of helping the cover up, in the sense that we continue to give support to a government who shows that they're involved in cold-blooded murder? And so a way that, you know, the U.S. could actually help deter this is withdraw support, but that's not happening at all. Although I will say that, you know, I think in the wake of this, even Lindsey Graham was like, oh my God, this Mohammed bin Salman's a nut job, and was voting to, I think, stop an arms sale or a limitation on the war in Yemen or something like that. So I guess in one sense, you know, this story has prompted, and, you know, the murder has prompted some legitimate, you know, demand from some parts of the political establishment to question the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. But now, you know, we're a year and a half or so past it, and nobody cares anymore. We're into the next thing, and we're selling Saudi Arabia weapons, and there's really no protest.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. It did trigger Khashoggi's murder did trigger some people who would typically, you know, defend the U.S.-Saudi alliance, like Lindsey Graham, to sort of like kind of go, whoa, like maybe we should rethink this a little bit. Although that was fairly brief. Like, you haven't heard Lindsey Graham talk about this much lately. But for Donald Trump specifically, I think if you listen to the way he talks about Saudi Arabia and like some of the deals that they do, some of the weapons purchase and stuff, he's very convinced that like this is very important to the U.S. economy, and that these deals are like proof of Trump's own, you know, negotiation skills and stuff. So I think he really, you know, that's really why he values Saudi Arabia, for these big, you know, high ticket deals. But, you know, as we've discussed in the show before, these deals don't have much to do with the U.S. economy at large. It's a very small little sector of it, and oftentimes these deals go to benefit executives and stuff. So it's not really it's not really employing that many Americans. So I think Trump puts way too much weight on the importance of these contracts and stuff. But I think that sort of is like, it goes a good way toward explaining why he hasn't been more, you know, why he didn't take the more Lindsey Grahamian, you know, sort of response to this. I think Trump is really, he really likes these deals that we make with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, well, and, you know, just everybody, please check out the show notes page today over at the Libertarian Institute, because I'm going to include another article just out, like, probably an hour before recording this, Will, by Kelley, Vlahos, making the exact point that the weapon sales to Saudi Arabia really aren't that important to U.S. jobs, and that this is just either a huge mistake on the part of the Trump administration, or I think it's a willful lie because it's an easy one to make. Oh, they're buying $100 billion of weapons, and people hear $100 billion of weapons and assume, well, $1 billion, that sounds like, I don't know, 5,000, 10,000 jobs. And so 100, do the math, and you end up with 1 million people employed, and you say, well, that sounds right to me. But really that isn't how it actually works out in economics and politics, and where the money ends up going. It's the people who negotiate the deals, who lobby Congress, they're making, big bucks. Those are, what it's doing is creating jobs for former congressmen when they happen to get voted out of office, or generals for when they retire. They're the ones that are going to benefit here because now Lockheed Martin has more money to pay them.
Yeah, the same reporter, Kelley Vlahos, has also done some good work talking about like some of the suburbs in Washington, D.C. and like how rich they are, how affluent they become. And that's like the result of some of these arms deals and some of this lobbying. So she's done a lot of good work on like different aspects of that.
So I guess if you don't have anything else to add on Khashoggi, we should move on to our military buildup stories here.
Yeah. In terms of the Khashoggi, the main update there was just his family has offered a reprieve to the killers, and there's still all kinds of questions surrounding what even happened there. So I think that's, just to summarize the Khashoggi segment.
Right. So China, we have a military buildup going on. Time and time again, especially the past few months where we've been doing these every Monday shows, we've talked about the risk of military buildups during the coronavirus, because especially on these naval vessels, breaks out, gets the whole crew infected pretty quickly. But yet we see the Trump administration is continuing with these kind of policies. So tell us about the latest one.
Sure, yeah. So, we've been talking a lot about like the Navy's sort of obsession with China lately. Just in the last few shows, we've talked about a new heavy bomber deployment in Guam, a couple of B-52 flyovers of the South China Sea. I think we've done like 40 of those this year already. Sailing destroyers to the Taiwan Strait near islands that China claims, and into the Yellow Sea, and all over the place. Like the last few weeks have been very eventful for the Navy and the Air Force. But the Navy now is going to be even busier out there in the Western Pacific, because now they've just embarked on this big new submarine mission, which they're labeling in their typical kind of military jargon a contingency response operation. And sort of that's how they're describing it. It's supposed to involve 7 submarines at least starting with 7. And I think those are right now all of the forward deployed submarines in the Pacific Fleet. So they're taking part in these contingency operations, But other than the 7 submarines, the Navy didn't really give much detail about what they're actually doing out there. They had some typical boilerplates, talking about supporting a free and open Indo-Pacific region and underpinning peace and stability in the region and stuff. That kind of typical nonsense. But I think the idea I get from the press release is like this is largely just another show of force operation where we're trying to field all this heavy military gear into the Pacific to send a message to China. And it's interesting too, because one of the places I read about this was Task and Purpose. And the way they characterize the mission, they're saying that the Navy is trying to prove that the COVID outbreak has not had an effect on their deployments. And so like this is also a message they're trying to send too, is that like, hey, we're our readiness hasn't been affected. And so I think that's kind of interesting, given that we have been talking a lot about that aspect of the pandemic, just like the impact on U.S. warships and stuff. And so the Navy is trying to say, like we're not, it's not having a big effect on us. We can still, field submarines and stuff into, these far-flung areas and these forward deployments. So, I think this submarine mission just adds to the long list of recent operations that are meant to, threaten and intimidate China. I already named a bunch of those examples of the show of force flyovers and sail-throughs and stuff. But last Thursday, we also had the Air Force amassing a bunch of warplanes in Japan at this transport hub. And like they explicitly declared it as it's supposed to send a message to our adversaries. Like they had a spokesperson come out and say like, we hope our adversaries will see that, we aren't affected. We are not deterred or something. And so, that's just another example of one of these show of force things they're doing lately. And I should note too that I've pointed this out in previous shows, but this is all happening as the Trump administration is really ramping up rhetoric against Beijing. Trump himself, if you listen to him in press conferences and stuff, he's been blaming China for the coronavirus like every chance he gets. He's constantly hurling these like pretty serious accusations about, covering up the outbreak and how this is all their fault. And the State Department has even disseminated a memo to diplomats telling them the same thing, like take up that same line and push the cover up idea as much as possible. And speaking of the State Department, we had Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, last week come out and give this insanely hawkish press conference directed at China. He's basically laying out a case for like why we should be at be at war with the Chinese, or a cold war with them. At least that's how the national interest put it, that he's laying out a new case for a new Cold War. I don't think he actually uses those words himself, but it's pretty clear that's what he's doing. And I guess nobody's told him that we already have a new Cold War with Russia. So I don't know. I guess we'll have to have two new Cold Wars. But so like on top of this flurry of military activity we've seen out in the Pacific, in the South and East China Seas, and in the Yellow Sea, we've also had on the political side, there's been all kinds of escalations in terms of accusations and attacks coming from the Secretary of State and the President. And we've even seen like some U.S. lawmakers, like they're starting to get emboldened. They're like suing the Chinese government. And the White House is threatening to pull funding to the World Health Organization over the stuff about China, over these accusations about covering up the pandemic. So like my point is, on multiple fronts here, we're really seeing like an escalation of hostilities with the Chinese, not only militarily, but also sort of in terms of politically and in rhetoric and stuff too.
So I guess my question is, do you have any idea of why Trump is doing this? I mean, I guess it could be hard to understand and explain the logic of the president, but do you have an idea of who his advisors are really pushing it? Is it just Pompeo? Because it just seems so stupid. I mean, coming into office, I think both of us were kind of thinking that you end up with even like at worst a Nixon kind of foreign policy, that type of American first, which means like we're going to continue the Cold War against Russia, but at least we're going to like make friends with China. We're going to at least end like the stupidest war in Vietnam. Yeah, he's going to bomb other countries, but maybe he'll end like the war in Afghanistan. And it doesn't seem like he's able to understand American first, even through that context, and is willing to continue to pick a fight with the entire world. So I don't know. I guess it just seems so dumb. How does he think he could get away with it? Sorry for the bad question.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think if you go back and look at his like national security strategy, or like his more like grand posture, or like his grand strategic thinking, all along it seems like his advisors have been trying to sort of parlay the America First agenda that he like campaigned on with this much more hawkish, blustery agenda that like they're coming from. And so, we have heard the administration talk before about wanting to sort of pivot from, these rinky-dink, counterterrorism conflicts in the Middle East, and they want great power competition. And so, like we've talked about that a bit before, how like the administration might sort of be pivoting over to that kind of footing now. But I mean, you would think that right in the middle of a global pandemic, you'd think that'd be a weird time to sort of like lean into your grand strategy and really start picking it up. But that looks like exactly what they're doing. Just in time for the pandemic, they're now finally embarking on this like, great power competition thing with the Chinese. At least that's how it looks to me.
Right. Well, and it's happening at the same time where we're trying to, I feel like, do a lot of other things. We're trying to enforce something of an oil embargo against Iran and Venezuela, and potentially, at least diplomatically, or somehow trying to intercept the shipments of oil going from Iran to Venezuela. And that's a story for more details for another day. But just, I don't know how he thinks that the U.S. Navy is able to, police the entire world and then at the same time carry out these enormous, war games or, military buildup and drills, again, in the middle of a pandemic when it seems like the resources could be doing just about anything else to a more productive use. And as there's I don't know how many millions of Americans unemployed, but I was like at a count of 40 million since the lockdown started, people applying for unemployment. Yep. So with all of us suffering and not having jobs and needing stuff, why waste all of our time, energy, and resources picking fights and, breaking down economic barriers and trade? I mean, just use the aircraft carriers as giant cargo ships, load them up with stuff and bring them back and forth. That way they're commerce and economy, goods are getting to where they need to go, but we're doing the exact opposite. And it's beyond frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you'd think that right now would be the exact time to do the precise opposite of what they're doing, but nonetheless they're launching all kinds of new, like every week it seems like we've come, each week we've had some new like far-flung mission that the Navy or the Air Force is embarking on, whether it's in the Caribbean or in the East China Sea or wherever, the Persian Gulf. They are not scaling this back for the pandemic by any means.
So in a part of this, and looking at the bigger, as you mentioned there, like the national security strategy and the great power competition, that when you're looking at what's going on with China, as you point out, can't be overlooked. That's a big part of Donald Trump's foreign policy, and to whatever extent the guy has a philosophy, and that the U.S. kind of foreign policy establishment has one right now. But we have this statement, I believe, by the U.S. arms negotiator saying that we're prepared to spend Russia and China into oblivion to win a new arms race. And I don't know. I hate to just keep insulting the administration here because it sounds like kind of lowbrow. And look, I know that not everybody who works for the State Department is a fool and a hawk. And, even like somebody like Mike Pompeo isn't just an idiot. Like, he has, they don't work out. And I think some of them are nefarious, but not to just mock these guys all the time. But what kind of stupid idea is it to say this when your nation has over $20 trillion in national debt and you have tens of millions of people unemployed? Like, just the timing of it and saying it. Also, it seems like if you're just threatening to spend up front that we're going to spend you to oblivion, they're just going to not spend the money because you're telegraphing your strategy. So I don't know if you have any idea what the hell this was.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does like all tie right back into this sort of Cold War posture that we're talking about. That this I think it was the arms control envoy Marshall Billingsley who told this to a DC think tank that we're going to spend our so-called adversaries into oblivion. He's very confident that we'd win any kind of arms race with the Russians and the Chinese. And I think he's sort of like playing off of this Cold War idea, which is pretty popular among kind of hawkish voices. That the U.S. won the Cold War by outspending the Soviet Union, and that the Soviets were so obsessed with staying ahead of us that we kind of tricked them into destroying themselves. Because they just weren't aware of I don't know how much they could spend or something. I don't know. I guess that's the argument that we spent so much that they just stopped paying attention to what spending might do to them. I don't know. But there are some, pretty good arguments against this whole concept. I mean, people like Andrew Coburn have pointed out that during the Cold War, what they called the missile gap with the USSR, which is they claimed that the Soviets had, X number more missiles than we do, and we have to catch up with them. People like Coburn have pointed out this is mostly a bogus construct, that it was mostly used to justify bigger military budgets here at home and hand more U.S. tax dollars to arms dealers and weapons contractors and stuff. And so Coburn called this threat inflation, where they were making the Soviet arsenal sound way bigger than it was, these Cold War hawks. And so the expenditures that they're claiming for the Soviet Union were also exaggerated. So they were not spending quite as much as is alleged. So I think that's sort of there might be some holes in this sort of very popular argument. I'm sure that overspending and poor economic management or whatever did play some big role in the collapse of the Soviet system. I'm not so convinced that this only happened because the U.S. government blew outrageous amounts of tax dollars. That just seems like a very convenient argument. Seems like too convenient of an argument. And we're not just speculating about it. This idea, this argument was used for decades to justify bigger military budgets in the U.S., saying that we have to catch up to the Soviets to meet the missile gap and stuff. And so I think that makes sense why it became such a popular story with the military industrial complex, but that doesn't make it true. But nonetheless, you still hear this guy Billingsley sort of making arguments on that basis that we've spent, we can outspend our adversaries. We did it once, we can do it again. But I think we should also point out here too that some important subtext around this whole conversation, this guy's talking about a potential arms race with the Russians and the Chinese. But an important thing to remember here is the New START Treaty, which is slowly becoming more and more relevant. We signed this, the U.S. signed the New START Treaty with the Russians back in 2010. And it's the major thing that's putting any real hard cap on our strategic nuclear weapons deployments. And so it limits how many ICBMs and warheads and stuff we can have at ready to go at any given time. So it's a pretty important treaty. And it's becoming more and more relevant because it's set to expire next year, early next year. And so there's pretty limited time to negotiate a new agreement or an extension before, the old one expires. And things are not really going too well in that regard in terms of coming to the table about this. And so it is a little worrying when you hear this guy, this tops arms control envoy talking about an arms race and how confident he is that we'll win one when the expiration of this major arms control treaty is coming up pretty soon. So I just think that's an interesting, confluence of issues there. And the major issue right now with the treaty is that the U.S. has decided all of a sudden that China must now also be part of the treaty. And it's just majorly complicating the whole thing if you have to add in a whole new party into this treaty. The Russians are ready to renegotiate it, but the Chinese, they have a way smaller nuclear arsenal. I think more than 10 times smaller than the U.S.'s. And so they're not really too enthusiastic about getting rid of some of their nukes when they have so many fewer. But nonetheless, I think that does tie in here, some of these arms control treaties. The Trump administration has destroyed several arms control agreements. The Iran nuclear deal and the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement. And now it looks like they're trying to, they're gunning for the New START treaty. And while our top arms control envoy, is waxing so confident about how we're going to win a arms race with the Russians, I just think that's worrying.
Well, there's a couple things that in this statement stuck out to me that really made the threat not make sense. One is that if you're saying this, again, telegraphing that strategy seems to kind of undermine it because the strategy is in part the propaganda around it. But, one of the things that makes it seem to me that obviously it's not working, the U.S. already outspends China 5 or 6 to 1 in Russia. I don't know. I think it's 15 or so to 1. To foreign policy dollars. And so if we're already spending that much more than Russia and China, I don't see how any economist could look at some kind of track and say that we could spend 15 times more than what Russia spends on weapons, and that would somehow bankrupt the Russians before it bankrupted the U.S. It just doesn't work that way. The other issue is I think it kind of proves that on weapon systems and military isn't enough to prompt Russia and China into spending on military. I know at least with the Russian military budget, it's stagnated over the past couple of years, and that it's been things like building new weapon system and breaking treaties that have pushed Russia and China into developing things like China's nuclear triad and Russia's hypersonic missile. So I don't know, if I were going to, not that I think this is a good idea, not recommending it, but it seems like if your goal was to have Russia and China spend themselves into oblivion, you would be building aircraft carriers that are empty shells, or claiming that your satellite could melt Moscow or change I don't know. You just make absurd claims. That way they have to, spend absurd amount of money on counter weapon systems. We could have done this with the missile defense systems, I suppose. I think at one point it was the former U.S. ambassador, I think to the Soviet Union, Matlock, that was talking to Putin and said hey, Putin, the anti-missile systems, they're not about first strike capabilities, and they don't work that well. And it's not about you. It's about a boondoggle to the weapons makers. And Putin says, yeah, but I have no choice, because if these weapon systems do work, it gives the U.S. first strike capability. I have to be able to respond. And so he develops hypersonic missiles. So if the U.S. had not spent all the money, it just, claimed to have developed these missiles, and I don't know how, but we're able to trick Russia into believing we had them, and then Russia had to go and spend money on hypersonic, then that's an effective strategy. That makes at least sense tactically. This seems absurd. So I don't know where you want to go to wrap up, Will, but any final remarks on Donald Trump's, I guess, grand foreign policy strategy here to just pick bigger and bigger fights with Russia and China?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what this Billingsley guy was talking about, it's not totally clear, what circumstances he was because, clearly there's already some kind of arms race with the Russia. There's already some kind of, you were just talking about, the Russians having to respond by developing, a new platform when we develop one. There's something going on already with that. But this guy was talking as if that's not happening yet. He was saying that we would not like that to happen, and it's the worst case scenario kind of thing. So it's not really clear what circumstance he would be really referring to of when we would be spending them into oblivion. Because as you're saying, we already massively outspend not only Russia and China but the rest of the world. if you look at like this group SIPRI puts together these studies every year of like how much more the U.S. is spending of all the other countries combined, and you can really see that. And so yeah, you would think that like if the strategy is to spend them into oblivion, that's already what we're doing. But apparently, I don't know. It's not totally clear like what circumstance you'd be referring to. But yeah, in terms of the Trump administration's just like broader like bellicosity toward the Russians and the Chinese and this great power competition stuff. Unfortunately, it seems like it might be getting worse as his administration goes on. Like it seems like he might even be trying to like sell his time in office a little bit and campaign a little bit for the next presidential run with some of this stuff where he's trying to like get some, maybe he's rushing to get some like achievements or whatever, the way that Obama kind of near the end of his first term was kind of rushing to have something to show for it. And so I wonder if maybe that's what the Trump administration's looking for. Although I don't know what they could get out of this in terms of the things that we've been discussing over the last few weeks of like, you know, these deployments and these policies and the new mission to target Venezuela and stuff. It doesn't seem like any of this is going to produce anything he's going to be able to sell to voters to get him reelected. So I don't know what he's thinking with a lot of this stuff.
Here's the crazy thing, though. I think Joe Biden is going to let Trump run as the dove again. I think Trump is going to be more dovish on both Russia and China than Joe Biden come November. And it's going to be hard to believe that that's the case. But, so far he's attacked Trump for being too soft on China. Certainly with the, whole Russiagate conspiracy theory, which, as a little teaser, I think we'll have a show coming up about that in the future. And it just seems like he still may give Trump the dove platform. So Will, plug your work, let people know where to find you and to keep up with the articles you write through the week.
All right. Yeah. I appreciate you having me on again. If you guys want to find what I'm writing, the best place probably is to go to my Twitter handle, at WKPANCAP. That's where I collect all my stuff at RT and elsewhere. RT, I don't get bylines there. I'm sort of just like, I work with the news team and I'm a staff writer there. But yeah, check out my Twitter handle. You can also find me at a couple of my stories at Consortium News. I got a big archive at the Daily Sheeple, and I got some at antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute.
Thanks for coming back on the show, Will.
Thanks, Cal.